guys, welcome back. We're ready to read chapter 8. You should be on page 74 in your novel study, so we're going to go ahead and get started. At first he thought it was a growl. In the still darkness of the shelter in the middle of the night, his eyes came open and he was awake, and he thought there was a growl. But it was the wind, a medium wind in the pines that had made some sound that brought him awake, and he was awake and hit with a smell. It terrified him. The smell was one of some musty rot that had made him think only of graves, with cobwebs and dust and old death. His nostrils widened, and he opened his mouth and eyes wider, and he could see nothing. It was too dark and too hard dark, with clouds covering even the small light from the stars, and he could not see. But the smell was alive and full in the shelter, and he thought it might be a bear. Thought of Bigfoot and every monster he had ever seen and every fright movie he had ever watched, and his heart hammered in his throat. Then he heard the slithering, a slithering, brushing sound near his feet. And as he kicked out as hard as he could, he kicked out and threw the hatchet at the sound, a noise coming from his throat. But the hatchet missed and sailed into the wall, where it hit the rocks with a shower of sparks, and his leg was instantly torn with pain, as if 100 needles had been driven into him. Ah! Now he screamed with pain and fear and skittered on his backside up into the corner of the shelter, breathing through his mouth and straining to see and to hear. The slithering sound moved again, and he thought toward him at first, and terror took him, and stopping his breath, he felt that he could see a low dark form, a bulk in the darkness, a shadow that lived, but now it moved away slowly, slithering and scraping as it moved away. He saw, or thought he saw, go out the door opening. He lay on his side for a moment, and then he pulled a rasping breath in and held it, listening to the attacker to return. When it was apparent that the shadow wasn't coming back, he felt the calf of his leg, where the pain was centered and spreading to fill the whole leg. His fingers generally touched a group of needles that had been driven through his pants into the fleshy part of his calf. They were stiff and very sharp on the ends, stuck out, and he knew then what his attacker had been. A porcupine had stumbled into his shelter, and when he had kicked at the thing, it had slapped him with his tail of quills. He touched each quill carefully. The pain made it seem as if dozens of them had been slammed into his leg, but there were only 8. Pinning the cloth against his skin, he leaned back against the wall for a minute, and he couldn't leave them in. They had to come out, but just touching them made the pain move more intense. So fast, he thought. So fast things changed. When he had gone to sleep, he had had the satisfaction that in just a moment all was different. He grasped one of the quills and held his breath and jerked. It sent pain signals in his brain in tight waves, and he grabbed another and pulled it, and then another quill. And when he had pulled all 4 of them, he stopped for a moment. The pain had gone from being a pointed injury pain to spreading up a hot smear up his leg and made him catch his breath. Some of the quills were driven in deeper than others, and they were torn when they came out. He breathed deeply twice, let out half of a breath out, and then went back to work. Jerk, pause, jerk, and 3 more times before he lay back in the darkness. Done. The pain filled his leg now, and with it came new waves of self-pity. Sitting alone in the dark, his leg aching, some mosquitoes finding him again, he started crying. It was all too much. Just too much, and he couldn't take it. Not the way it was. He can't take it this way, alone with no fire and in the dark, and the next time it might be something worse, maybe a bear. And it wouldn't be quills in his leg, it would be worse. I can't do this, he thought again and again. I can't. Brian pulled himself up until he was sitting upright back in the corner of the cave. He put his head down on his arms across his knees with stiffness, taking his left leg, and cried until he was cried out. He did not know how long it took, but later he looked back on the time of crying in the corner of the dark cave and thought of it as when he learned the most important rule of survival, which is that feeling sorry for yourself didn't work. It wasn't just that it was wrong to do or that it was considered incorrect. It was mere that it just didn't work. When he sat alone in the darkness and cried and was done, all done with it, nothing had changed. His leg was still hurt, it was still dark, and he was still alone, and the self-pity had accomplished nothing. At last he slept more, but already his patterns were changing, and this night his sleep was light, resting a doze more than a deep sleep, with small sounds awakening him twice in the rest of the night. In the last doze period before daylight, before he awakened fully, finally with the morning light and the clouds of new mosquitoes, he dreamed. This time it was not his mother, not of the secret, but of his father at first, and then of his friend Terry. In the initial segment of the dream, his father was standing on the side of the living room looking at him, and it was clear from his expression that he was trying to tell Brian something. His lips moved, but there were no sound, not even a whisper. He waved his hands at Brian and made gestures in front of his face as if scratching something, and he worked something up to make a word in his mouth, but at first Brian could not see it. Then the lips made a minimal shape, but no sound came. Brian could not hear or understand it, and he wanted to so badly. It was so important to understand his father, to know what he was saying. He was trying to help, trying so hard to help. And when Brian couldn't understand, he looked cross, the way he did when Brian asked questions more than once, and then faded. Brian's father faded into a fog place Brian couldn't not see or dream was almost over and seemed to be when Terry came. He was not gesturing to Brian, but was sitting in the park on the bench looking at the barbecue pit, and for a time nothing happened. And then he got up and he poured some charcoal and put a bag into a cooker, and then some starter fluid, and he took a flick shape of a lighter and lit the fluid. When it was burning, the charcoal was as getting hot. He turned, noticing Brian for the first time in the dream. He turned and smiled and pointed at the fire as if to say, "See, a fire." But it meant nothing to Brian except that he wished he had fire. He saw a grocery sack on the table next to Terry. Brian thought it might contain hot dogs and chips and mustard, and he could think only of food. But Terry shook his head and pointed again at the fire. And twice more he pointed to the fire and made Brian see the flames. Brian felt his frustration and anger rise and thought, all right, I see the fire, but so what? I don't have a fire. I don't know about fire. I need a fire. I know that." His eyes opened and there was light in the cave, a gray, dim light of morning. He wiped his mouth and turned his leg, which had been stiffened like wood. There was a thirst and a hunger, and he ate more raspberries from the jacket. They had spoiled a bit and seemed softer and mushier, but still had a rich sweetness. He crushed the berries against the roof of his mouth with his tongue and drank the sweet juice as it ran down his throat. A flash of metal caught his eye, and he saw his hatchet in the sand where he had thrown it at the porcupine in the dark. He scooted up, wincing a bit when he bent his stiff leg and crawled to where the hatchet lay. He picked it up and examined it and saw a chip at the top of the head. The nick wasn't too large, but the hatchet was important to him, was his only tool, and he could not just have thrown it. He should keep it in his hand and make a tool of some kind to help push an animal away. Make a staff, he thought, or a lattice, and save the hatchet. Something came, and then a thought as he held the hatchet, something about the dream, his father, and Terry, but he couldn't put it down. Ah! He scrambled out and stood in the morning sun and stretched his back muscles and sore leg. The hatchet was still in his hand, and he stretched and raised it over his head and caught the first rays of the morning sun. The first light in the silver of the hatchet, and it flashed a brilliant gold in the light. Like fire. That's it, he said. Or that's what they were trying to tell me. Fire. The hatchet was the key to it all. When he threw the hatchet at the porcupine in the cave and missed, it hit the wall and showered sparks. A golden shower of sparks in the dark, as golden with fire as the sun was now. The hatchet was the answer. That's what his father and Terry had been trying to tell him. Somehow he could get fire from the hatchet. The sparks would make fire. Brian went back to the shelter and studied the wall. It was some form of chalky granite or sandstone and had embedded as large pieces of darker stone, a harder and darker stone. It only took a moment to find where this hatchet had struck. The steel had nicked into the edge of one of the darker stone pieces. Brian turned the head backward so that he could strike it with the flat near the hatchet and hit the rock gently. Too gently, and something happened. He struck harder, and a glancing blow, 2 or 3 weak sparks skipped out on the rock and died immediately. He swung harder and held the hatchet so that it hit the longer sliding blow, and a black rock exploded in fire. Sparks flew so heavily that several of them skittered and jumped on the sand beneath the rock, and he smiled and struck again and again. There could be fire here, he thought. I will have a fire here. And he struck again. I will have the fire from the hatchet. So this is a very important part of the story because this is another survival piece that he really needs. So we're going to go on and read chapter 9. Brian found it was a long way from sparks to a fire. Clearly there had to be something for the sparks to ignite. Some kind of tinder or kindling, but what? He brought some dried grass in and tapped sparks into it and watched them die. He tried small twigs, breaking them into small pieces, but that was worse than the grass. And then he tried a combination of the two, of grass and twigs, and nothing. He had no trouble getting sparks, but the tiny bits of hot stone or metal, he couldn't tell which were just sputtered and died. He needed something finer, something softer, fine and fluffy to catch the bits on fire. Shredded paper would be nice, but he had no paper. So close, he said out loud, so close. He put the hatchet in his belt and went out of the shelter, limping on his sore leg. There had to be something. There just had to be. Man had made fire. There had been fire for thousands, maybe millions of years ago. There had to be a way. He dug into his pockets and found a $20 bill in his wallet. Paper, worthless paper out here. But if he could get a fire going, he ripped the 20 into tiny pieces and made a pile of pieces and hit the sparks onto them. Nothing happened. They wouldn't make the sparks. But there had to be a way, just had to do it. Not 20 feet to his right, leaning over the water, were birches. He stood looking at them for a full half-minute before registered in his mind. They were the beautiful white bark from the clean, slightly speckled paper. Paper. He moved to the tree where the bark was peeling from the trunk and lifted it in tiny tendrils, almost fluffs. Brian plucked some of them loose, rolled them in his fingers. They seemed to be flammable, dry, and nearly powdery. He pulled and twisted bits off the trees and packing them in his hand while he picked some with the other, picking and gathering until he had a wad close to the size of a baseball. Then he went back to the shelter and arranged the half ball of birch bark peelings on the base of the black rock. As an afterthought, he threw in the remaining parts of the $20 bill, and he struck, and a stream of sparks fell into the bark and it quickly died. But this time, one spark fell on one small hair of dry bark, almost a thread of bark, and the seemed to glow a bit brighter before it died. The material had to be finer. There had to be a soft and incredibly fine nest of sparks. I must make a home for the sparks, he thought, a perfect home so they won't stay and they won't make fire. He started ripping the bark with his fingernails at first, and then when that didn't work, he used the sharp edge of his hatchet, cutting the bark into slivers, hairs so fine that they would almost not there. It was painstaking work, slow work, and he stayed with it for over 2 hours. Twice he stopped for a handful of berries and once to go to the lake for a drink, and then back to work, the sun on his back until at last he had a ball of fluff as big as a grapefruit, dry birch bark fluff. He positioned his bark nest, as he thought of it, at the base of the rock and used his thumb to make a small depressions in the middle, slamming the back of the hatchet down across the black rock. A cloud of sparks rained down, and most of them missing the nest, but some, perhaps 30 or so, hit in the depression, and those 6 or 7 found fuel and grew and smoldered, causing the spark to take on a red glow. And then they went out. Close, he was so close. He repositioned the nest and made a new and smaller den with his thumb and struck again. More sparks and a slight glow, and then nothing. It's me, he thought. I'm doing something wrong. I do not know this. A cave dweller would have had fire by now. A Cro-Magnon man would have had fire by now. But I do not know this. I do not know how to make fire. Maybe not enough sparks. He settled the nest in place once more and hit the rocks with a series of blows as fast as he could. The sparks flowed like a golden waterfall, and at first they seemed to take, and then there were several mini sparks that found life and took briefly, but they all died. Starved. He leaned back, and they were like me. They were starving, and it wasn't quantity. There were plenty of sparks that they needed more. I would kill, he thought suddenly, for a book of matches. Just one book, just one match I would kill. What makes fire? He thought back to school and all those science classes. Had he ever learned what had made fire? Did a teacher ever stand up and say, "This is what you do to make fire"? He shook his head and he tried to focus his thoughts. What does it take? You have to have fuel, he thought. And the bark was fuel. Oxygen, there has to be air. He needed to add air. He had to fan on it or blow on it. He made the nest ready again, held the hatchet back and tensed, struck down in 4 more quick blows, sparks coming down, and he leaned down as fast as he could, and he blew. Too hard. There was a bright, almost intense glow, and then it was gone. He had blown it out. Another set of strikes, more sparks. He leaned and blew, but gently this time, holding back and aiming the stream of his air from his mouth to hit the brightest spot of sparks that had fallen in a tight mass of bark hair, and Brian centered his efforts there. The sparks grew with a gentle breath, and there was a red glow that moved from the sparks themselves into the bark, moved and grew and became worms, growing red worms that crawled into the bark hairs and caught the other threads of bark and grew until there was a pocket of red as big as a quarter, glowing, a red coal of heat. Then he ran out of breath and paused to inhale. A red ball suddenly burnt into a flame. Fire, he yelled. I've got fire. I've got it. I've got it. I've got it. But the flames were thick and oily and burned fast, consuming the ball of bark as fast as if it was gasoline. He had to feed the flames and keep them going. Working as fast as he could, he carefully placed the dried grass and wood pieces and tried to first on top of the bark, and it was gratified to see them take. But they would go fast, and he needed more and more, and he could not let the flames go out. He ran from the shelter to the pines and started tearing off low, dead, small limbs. Then he threw in shelter and went back for more, threw those in, and squatted for a break and feed the hungry flames. When the small wood was going well, he went out and found a large wood and did not relax until that was going. Then he leaned back against the wood brace of his door opening and smiled. I have a friend, he thought. I have a friend now, a hungry friend, but a good one. I have a friend named Fire. Hello, Fire. The curve of the rock made an almost perfect drawing flue that carried the smoke through the cracks up the roof but held the heat. It kept the fire small. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would keep anything like the porcupine from coming into the door again. A friend and a guard, he thought. So much from a little spark. A friend and a guard from a tiny spark. He looked around and wished he had somebody to tell this to show this thing he had done. But there was nobody. Nobody but the trees, the sun, the breeze, and the lake. Nobody. And he thought, rolling in his thoughts, as smoke curling over his head and a smile still half on his face, he thought, I wonder what they're doing now. I wonder what my father is doing now. I wonder what my mother is doing now. I wonder if she is with him. So this was a big step, getting the fire going. So I'm curious to see what Brian figures out now in his survival out here. And I'm curious to see, when does he ever get saved? Does he get saved? Or does he spend the rest of his time out in these woods? So stay tuned for chapter 10.